Welcome to the Next Steps to Leadership with your host, Dr. Stephen Oliver. In each episode, we invite experts to share their passion and their leadership journey to help you in your next steps. You can find this show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on our website, hrcvision.com. Now, here's the host of Next Steps to Leadership, Dr. Stephen Oliver.
Well, hello and welcome to all. Thank you so much for coming to my podcast, Taking the Next Steps in Leadership. I'm Dr. Stephen Oliver, or Dr. O. The purpose of the podcast is to give some ideas and techniques and tips to younger and newer managers to help them in their career as they go forward. I invite senior executives, I have human resource professionals, nursing leaders, learning leaders, business owners to come in and talk about their career, their successes, and to give some ideas, tips, and techniques for taking that next step. So I'm really excited to have our guest today. The topic is management and leadership effectiveness. So I'd like to welcome Dr. David Almeda. This is a good friend and colleague of mine. Dr. Almeda has an extensive career. He's currently a principal at Mainsail Consulting, and he is a retired Chief Human Resource Officer at CHROs and UKG. He's also a former VP of Global HR at Staples. He is an award-winning CHRO, receiving several awards for his innovation and what he's done in human resources. He's a member of the Society for Human Resource Management, and he's on a board of director and advisors at several organizations. In addition, he's a guest lecturer at the University of Michigan and the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Almeda holds a doctorate of education from the University of Pennsylvania in combination of the Graduate School of Education and the Wharton School of Business. This degree is in adult learning and the business of learning. So welcome, Dave. Welcome, Dr. Almeda. Really glad to have you. How's it going? How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for the nice introduction there, Dr. O. I'm not sure who that guy is, but he sounds like it might be worth listening to a little bit, but I don't know. I think you might have oversold it a little bit, Dr. O.
All right. Well, really glad to have you. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you're up to, Dr. Almeda? What's going on? Tell us a little bit about yourself, just to start out before we...
Yeah, sure. So retired, as you said, in 2022, actually, from what was then UKG, which was a combination or made through a combination of a merger with Ultimate Software and CHROs, which happened in 2020. So worked on that for a couple of years and then retired in 22. And then since that time, I've tried to find things that are, kind of in the area of either kind of giving back, which is some of the nonprofit work that I do, some of the nonprofit board work, and also some of the teaching stuff that I do. You mentioned Michigan at the Ross School there and at Penn. And both those two things are just, fun for me because I get to interact with people who are interested, kind of like this podcast, and kind of learning more and being better leaders and all those different things. Mainsail, I created as a way to kind of push everything that I was being asked to do into one kind of clean company that I could have out in front there. I work honestly as little as I can, but there are people that ask me to do certain things.
Right.
What's that?
I said that's a great strategy for retirement.
Yeah, no, it doesn't work. I'm not great at it.
I want some tips on that.
I'm working on it. I'm not terrific at it, but I do help out folks that ask, mostly CHROs, some other business leaders in different areas, coaching and so forth, and that's fun for me. It's also giving back. I don't really look at it as work. And then the rest is spending time. We have a house in Maine and a house in New Hampshire, and spending time with family and friends, and all that. So I'm trying to be that retired guy. Still working on how to do that right for me.
But that's great. Sounds fantastic, and hopefully it's not too hot there. It's been a hot.
No, it's nice today
everywhere. That's great. So I wanted to know if you could first tell us just a little bit about your roles at Staples and UKG, a little bit about what you did and some of the things, some of the initiatives and things you were working on with them.
Yeah, so Staples was about 16 and a half years, almost 17 years. Came there at the right time. When I first started there, we were just exploding. It was mostly retail at that time, and we were opening stores every 48 hours. That's how
Wow.
it was back in the day. This is before big box and .com wasn't a huge thing. This goes back to like 1994, if you can believe that. But yeah, so I went there because I wanted to be with a company that was growing, and that was local, and it was fairly close to home for us. And then from there, I did all kinds of things there, from strategy. Worked in Europe for about a year and a half in a strategy role. Did HR in every single function. Grew the contract business. Worked in the international business. Worked in the contract business. And the commercial business, which is slightly different, more like catalog. So it's a great experience. And also during that time is when I was asked to join the program at Penn, where I met Dr. O, and they were nice enough to support me for that as well. So, but in 2010, it was I think just clear to me that it was time to do something slightly different, and there was lots of criteria for why I moved where I moved to, but I'd say the biggest one was the leadership. The CEO, whose name was Aaron Hain, who's now the chairman of the board at UKG, but he was looking to do something different. He wanted to create kind of a special organization that was talent focused, and kind of the core of it was, which I'll talk about in a second, that great businesses are powered by great people. He really believed that. And a lot of people say that, but there's a difference between saying it and believing it. And then for the next, almost 13 years, we worked to kind of bring all that to life in pretty cool ways. And what I'm going to talk about today is just one of those, this manager effectiveness piece.
Okay, sounds really great. So maybe leading into that, what were some of the strategic things that you implemented in human resource to make it successful?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think most people, when they talk about human resources, think, benefits and compensation and, all those different things. And I think those are important. I would think about those as potential differentiators, but definitely something that has to be like a dial tone. When you pick up the phone, it needs to be there. It needs to be
Right.
reliable. It
Yeah.
has to be done well, and all those things. And there's ways to wrap innovation in there. But at the end, what are you trying to do? Like, as a function, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to create the best benefits? Well, maybe, but that's not really an end goal. And for us, the end goal was what I already described, which is create a great organization. And the way we thought about doing that was through individual and organizational kind of optimization, right? So how do you create an organization where individuals can be working at their kind of peak and at their best performance, and where, as a result of that, organizations just thrive? And again, I'll go back to Aaron Ain. He believed that, and I believe that. And for almost 14 years, we worked on creating that together.
Sounds exciting. And I'm addicted to the Staples toners. Um, in your
I'm
previous
sorry
role.
to hear that.
That's the one main thing that I still use. But yeah, no, I really respond to this individuals, making them happy and making them effective to connect to organizational effectiveness. So I think for our audience, do you mind just sharing a little bit, Dr. Almeida, about what is management and what is leader effectiveness?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. You said it in the beginning, and I think that's where it all starts. There's so many leaders out there that just want to be effective. They want to do well as a leader. They want to make the team better. They want to feel better about themselves and the way they show up every day. And you talk to so many leaders, and I certainly have over the course of my career, and they're like, I don't know how to do that. I can go to the New York Times best-selling list or the Business Book best-selling list, and I can pull off of there. Whether it's 5 dysfunctions of a team or top rating. There's hundreds of books out there that talk about, and I'm not recommending anything I'm saying. I'm not saying I'm not recommending it either, but what my point if you try to figure it out that way, you're going to be kind of ferreting around for quite a while trying to figure out how to be an effective leader. And that's kind of what we saw in the organization. And then the other thing that we saw is, or at least believed, our hypothesis going in was that, in order for people to be engaged and work effectively and all that, it really came down to what were the dynamics and what was the kind of efficacy of the manager and employee relationship. And so that's what we really dug into, is making that as effective as possible. So our hypothesis was that whole manager effectiveness thing drove, among other things, engagement, retention, and performance. So that's where we started with this, Dr. O. And then we set out to prove all that in an evidence-based way.
And any examples of that manager effectiveness? What might be a couple of things that were some examples on how those managers who truly were effective?
That's the kind of crux of the question right there. We did not take the approach where we decided to kind of try a bunch of stuff, kind of like throw it against the wall and see if it stuck. We did what we always do. We took kind of a 3-step process to answer your question, which is define. So basically figure out, again, evidence-based way, how do great managers lead every day? Measure, how are individuals performing once we know what they're supposed to do? Can we measure how they're doing it? And then enable, how do we help managers get better? So if you figure out what an effective manager looks like, what they need to focus on, that's great, but how do you develop them at the end of the day? And I want to really point out that the work that we did, and this was UKG, well, Cronus and then UKG, wasn't a gotcha. Like our intent here isn't to find bad managers and punish them. Our intent here was to help managers get insight into where they had opportunities from an efficacy standpoint and go from there, right? And so that's what we did. So how did we do that? That's what I just said was kind of a mouthful, but let me kind of step back a second. So we started with data, and Dr. O, you know me for a while, so that probably isn't a surprise. We went after all the data we had. So we had engagement scores and our engagement results. We did a survey every 6 months. We had results from that and comments from that. And we had leadership awards. We, even before manager effectiveness, rewarded our top leaders like our top salespeople. So if you were a top leader, you were nominated by your team, here's what we do. Here's what my manager did. And then we'd pick about 20 of those and reward them just like a top salespeople think, award trips and, kind of dinner and award ceremonies with the top team, and including the CEO, et cetera. And so we had that. We had data from retention and turnover. We had many of these data sets. So what we did is we distilled these all down, and then we figured out who were good managers from these data sets and who were bad, and then we put focus groups together. We didn't tell people you were in a good manager or a bad manager focus group, but our intent was to figure out what are good managers doing that bad managers aren't, or at least effective managers aren't. What is the difference? What are the actual behaviors? And then we did external benchmarking. So Google did some work in this area. The name of the project that they were doing under Laszlo Block, it was run by a person named Michelle Donovan at Google, who we've met with a few times. What's called Project Oxygen. And that was interesting just from a benchmark standpoint. Nothing we did exactly, but it was interesting work that they did. Facebook did something similar, not as rigid, I would say, but certainly helpful from a benchmarking standpoint. And then Deloitte did something in the form of mostly in the area of how they ask questions. They ask very specific questions. I'll talk about that in a second. So we put it all together, and we felt at the end of the day, at least we had an idea of what most effective managers did, right? And then we did a small pilot to make sure that actually, it was working. But when I say pilot, when you get into the measure part of it, we had twice a year, we had employees rate managers. So very specifically, we knew the questions to ask. For example, Does my manager share strategic initiatives? Does my manager have career conversations with me? I'll talk more about those things in a second. But it wouldn't say just my manager. It would say, does my manager Dr. O? Does my manager Dave Almeda? Whatever. And then individual managers got reports. Every single manager got a report. They shared it with their team, so there was accountability. And they said, "Here's the stuff. Here's me, and here's the stuff I'm going to work on." And I'll talk more about those results in a second. And then the enable part was just coaching, individual coaching, targeted coaching, and rewards recognition, those kind of things. So there's a lot, I guess.
Right. But I mean, what I'm really glad to hear is your whole strategic approach, starting from the beginning and looking at data and looking at each individual manager, and then, looking at ways to improve and help them and not beating them up, and then benchmarking outside and having a pilot. And I think the rewards are just so important, to reward and acknowledge people and on a regular basis. How did that help in that continual awards and rewards?
Well, it was I think in a lot of organizations, the people that get those rewards are people that are kind of the rainmakers, or certainly not. You don't see it a lot in leadership, and I think if we were going to say that, and we did, when I say we, I mean the whole leadership team, that this was important, then it would be a little disingenuous not to reward them in ways that are, kind of. And the other part is it gave their teams a way to recognize that their manager, their leader, was doing a great job. And I think, I'll talk more about how we tied in things like compensation and promotions and all those things in a second. But it was a kind of closed loop system that was meant to both identify folks that needed development and reward folks that were doing exceptional work. And fortunately, especially after the first couple cycles, it worked pretty well.
That's fantastic. So on the converse of that, you're talking about success. Are there any things that you notice that could derail leadership or derail some of these manager and their effectiveness?
Yeah, it's funny if you go back to what some of the great manager attributes were, and I'll share broadly what those were. A lot of the managers, when they first got their reports, were surprised because they thought they were doing everything possible. It goes back to, if you don't know what you don't know, and you're trying to do the best you can with really no insight into how that's landing with your folks. And so the four main categories were: communicates openly and honestly, and I can talk about that more if you're interested, empowers and enables their folks, develops and encourages their folks, and supports the whole person. And depending on the leader, they kind of missed in a couple of these different areas. Like communicates, maybe they weren't having regular staff meetings, maybe they weren't doing one-on-ones, maybe they weren't sharing how the work the group did tied into the overall strategy, maybe they weren't giving clear objectives to their folks. There's a lot of things that fell into that category. Empowers and enables, especially I don't mean to be stereotypical, but I would say a lot of that happened in the engineering side. Not a surprise, I guess, but managers were micromanaging, and it wasn't because they cared, but what they did as a result of this information coming to them is took a step back and said, okay, I can micromanage for the rest of my time here, or I can figure out who doesn't need micromanaging and kind of give them the kind of empowerment to do their job. And the folks that do, let's work on that. Let's figure out why they're not making deadlines. Let's figure out what they need development-wise, direction-wise, or whatever. And then and kind of give them the ability to get things done, as opposed to me always being on top of them. And that took some cycles too, as you might imagine. And then develops and encourages. We had a lot of folks that, we encouraged people to look outside their kind of function. And let's say somebody was in inside sales and they wanted to try outside sales. Or let's say somebody was in even my function and they wanted to try or some other function. We had methodologies that allowed people to participate on teams. We had an internal job kind of team posting site where people could say, I want to try this project. And if the manager supported them, then obviously that's a good thing. If they didn't, and they didn't. And yes, before you ask the question, if someone wasn't performing really well, they might not get the nod to do that. But if they were, then we should be encouraging them to kind of be the best they can be. And you'd be surprised how positively people reacted to that kind of thing. And the last one was support the whole person. And I would say, for senior leaders, I would say this is the one that was the biggest miss. When you do this, and this kind of twice a year, your employees rate your manager thing, you cast this huge net, right? So when you cast that huge net, you get ratings for every single manager, and we broke those into quartiles, and I can talk more about that if you want me to. But there was an executive committee member, so one of the 10 people that ran the company, that fell into the bottom of the fourth quartile. So they're kind of among the lowest of the low. And so I took that person on as a coaching, kind of responsibility, and I was happy to do that. And but their opportunity was in this supports the whole person side, and it came down to they just were being very sterile in their communications. And the reason for that was they, in their own personal life, were dealing with and had been for quite a while. They had a child that was disabled, and it was kind of at home. It was pretty much all they kind of dealt with, and I think they were trying to draw a bright line between here's work, here's home, and we just kind of blurred that line a little bit, and the relationships that formed with his team as a result of that. It wasn't a lack of respect thing. It was just kind of like, I don't really know who you are, kind of a thing, and that matters. People, in order for someone to be effective, you kind of have to know what's going on in their life to some degree, so you can, and they have to feel comfortable coming to you saying, hey, this is going on, I need to do whatever. And that was a big miss for people. So it depends, is the answer to your question. There was different flavors for different leaders in the organization.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, I was getting ready to ask you about that. Was it more performance improvement, PIP, or was it more coaching? And it sounds like that was your strategy of doing more coaching. And I agree with you. It's so critical to get to know people, what's going on in their lives, because that really can impact and affect what's happening. So it sounds like you really went in that direction.
Yeah, and I think that's not a skill that comes naturally to people. And I don't think I've ever read a leadership book that says build a relationship. But that's
Exactly.
Maybe we should write one, Dr. O. But I think that's a piece of it. And at the end of the day, it comes down to does my manager truly care about me? Which sounds I don't know if that sounds, but that ended up being the actual question. Does my manager, Dr. O, truly care about me?
Right.
And if the answer to that question is no, huge impact on engagement, productivity, retention, all those things. And so, the great thing about at least from my perspective, doing it the way we did is we weren't guessing at some point if these things had a correlation to engagement, retention. We knew. And so I can talk more about how we knew if you want me to, but we knew.
So, in anything further you'd like to say? I mean, I'm just curious, anything more about leadership effectiveness, any more strategies or any more things that you all did to make your organization a success?
Yeah. So let me kind of, I'm going to explain the methodology that we used here.
Yes.
And then you can ask questions if needed or helpful or whatever. Obviously, happy to answer anything. So I mentioned earlier we did engagement surveys twice a year. Now, I would like to tell you that we were smart enough to say, hey, you know what? If we put these 14 management effectiveness questions in the twice a year engagement survey, we're going to figure out all kinds of things like the correlation between these questions and engagement. But we did not think of that. I, for 100% sure, did not think of that. But nobody else did either. But it turned out by doing it that way, at the end, you ended up, and I wish I could show you the graphic, but at the end, you ended up getting this really clear picture of, top managers, let's say the top quartile, their engagement levels were close to 100%. On average, it was in the first round, it was 94. And then right with that, a correlation to retention and turnover, also, probably 20 points higher than the fourth quartile. Right. So then you kind of go down the graph all the way to the bottom, and you saw engagement levels In the fourth quartile, that averaged more like 60% or
I see.
50%. And then you saw retention levels that were 20 points lower than the top, right? So it wasn't like maybe these things are related. We used a third party, we used an academic institution actually to do this work for us, because we sent individual data to, it was actually University of South Carolina. They have a doctoral program in HR, a PhD program. So the head of that program took this on with his team. And so we sent them individual data so they could do things like say, this individual, for example, on retention, left, like, I don't know, 6 months after this survey, and they answered these questions this way. And they could start to do predictive stuff for us. We didn't do that ourselves because it, obviously confidentiality, but it gave us huge insights. And one of the insights, and this probably shouldn't surprise you, but 50%, a full 50% of the variance between those managers or leaders, those employees that were engaged, highly engaged, and those that weren't, could be explained by this manager effectiveness thing. So if you had a high score, you were highly engaged, you had a low score, you weren't, but 50% of that difference was how effective my manager is. Like, kind of data wise, pretty cool, right? So, and I'm not going to bore you with the rest of the stats, but I will tell you that over time, it only got better as we kind of went through different cycles, and managers, in the first round, we didn't hold managers accountable for their results, meaning we shared the results. We didn't share the results with their boss because we wanted them just to focus on development, right? We didn't want them to be called out as a poor manager, right? So they had 6 months to kind of work through whatever they wanted to work through, and then they came back and were surveyed again. And you mentioned earlier about, and I get this question a lot, were there actually people who did not actually get this or weren't with the program? Or well, the answer to that question is yes. There were probably 5% that are like, I don't know. I never would have thought my job as a manager was to manage. And so depending on a lot of other factors, but our goal was to retain them and maybe put them in an individual contributor role as equal as we could. But if they were just like, this is stupid, then we obviously did what you might think we did.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let me just ask you quickly.
That.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Dave, were there any like telltale signs for someone who was in that fourth quartile, 60%? Did you see any actions or behaviors? I mean, you mentioned the one person who had childcare issues, but I'm just curious, did you see any other signs of these folks when they would kind of be in that?
There was, yeah, that's a good question. There was a disproportionate number of newer managers, that shouldn't surprise you, right? That just hadn't kind of had tested things themselves over the years. And there were some situations where we had to reorganize their team because, if somebody has 20 direct reports, they're not going to be an effective manager. So we needed to do that. And there were other situations, and this is probably the most common one. People just didn't have the ability. Like, I get asked the question a lot, does everybody have the innate ability to be a leader, effective leader? And the answer to that is no.
Right.
I wish the answer to that was yes, but it really isn't. I mean, it's not so much, it isn't really, I don't want to be, I just don't have the ability to relate to people in a way that, or communicate or set, whatever the factor is that's holding them back. There was a decent amount of that. And so in those situations, we would put them into a nice individual contributor role, and we'd work to do that over time. We didn't take any action on any manager in the fourth quartile besides developmental unless it was an organizational structure thing, until three surveys went by. So think about a year and a half, right? So because if you think about kind of practically in an organization. Let's say you're going through major change. Let's say you're kind of, you have performance, whatever it might be. There's got to be little blips here and there that are gonna affect your manager effectiveness. And we don't want to penalize people because then you start to get behaviors like, well, I'm not going to fire that person, or I'm not going to, talk to that person. I'm not going to take care of the performance issue, or whatever it might be. transfer them, do whatever, because I don't want to see my manager effectiveness go down.
Right.
And they don't want that either, right? And so we had a 3-cycle kind of rule, which worked pretty well. But yeah, it was interesting, still in place. When Ultimate Software was brought on board, so we kind of combined UKG. We rolled it out there also. There's a kind of burn-in period though. People have to get results. People have to get developed. People have, you know what I mean? New hires, we have an orientation now for new hires. I didn't talk about this, but it's kind of hardwired into the systems now. So recruiting and selection, we have, as you might guess, competency questions. Why would you hire a manager that can't be a manager in the way you need him, an effective manager in the organization, right? We had development around onboarding. We had kind of a jumpstart program for new managers that kind of gave them a sense of what they might need to work on. Development, I mentioned, we used both virtual and then in-person coaching. We had in-person classes, usually led by an effective leader and someone from the kind of learning team or someone from the outside. And then rewards, we talked about rewards. So it was hardwired that way as well. It definitely played into your performance review. But also, if you were a VP candidate and your scores for three periods were in the bottom 20%, you're not getting promoted to a VP.
Right.
That it would just make the whole program a farce, right? If you're not kind of putting those kind of teeth behind the thing. So
it sounds like a great program from start to finish of the life cycle of the employee. I agree with the onboarding process is so important, and having a mentor going beyond just those first couple of weeks and months, and helping them out through that first year. So it sounds like you really put a lot of energy and time into that. Any additional things about your leadership effectiveness strategies that you implemented?
yeah, well, the thing I'd say is there are some kind of call it keys to success, and I had this conversation really recently with a company that was interested in, and I've had this conversation with, I don't know, 25 companies probably over the years, but a lot of them like the output, increase retention, increase engagement, for whatever reason. I guess who wouldn't like that? But there's work to be done. So before you can really make this effective and roll it out, and the first one I would say that's a prerequisite is you kind of have to have a high trust culture. You have to be in a situation where leaders actually believe that what you're trying to do is develop them, not kind of, let's say, reduce the number of leaders you have in the organization, right? I mean, if you don't have that high trust culture, if you don't have our engagement scores before we did this were probably top 5%. After we did it, we're probably top 1%. We were every great place to work list. We were, at or near the top, towards the end chronos before the merger, and even after the merger, we were still on the top of those lists. But that was based on a culture that truly valued employees and put them first. And I don't think employees, including leaders, and if you don't have something that kind of authentically is that way, you're probably gonna get in trouble when you try to put this in place, because it's gonna be viewed the way that it's viewed based on what the culture is that exists when you try to put it in place. So that's a big one. The second key is kind of early and active involvement with all levels of leadership. So you have to get them on board and comfortable so they can both understand it themselves, understand how the whole thing works, and also have conversations with employees that they feel comfortable with, because this thing flips the whole accountability thing on its head a little. Because it used to be, what's a manager do? They rate their employees, and here's your rating. Hope you like it. If you don't like it, I guess go talk to somebody. But now it's like, oh, by the way, here's what you guys rated me. Every manager with 3 or more direct reports got a report every 6 months that said, here's the 4 areas, broadly, and all the questions, and here's what you need to work on, or at least here's what you should work on based on where you are versus your peers or what quartile you're in or whatever. And basically like, this is me as a leader, and that's a big change. We had some leaders, and I get this question, I'm assuming you're probably in the back of your head at least thinking about this. They try to manipulate the results early on, and you could see it, because if they had low engagement scores and high turnover, and then the results were like, top of the first quartile, you're like, really, or something going on there, and then the team would do spot checks to make sure that kind of shenanigans weren't happening. But we didn't have a lot of that, thankfully, based on the work we had done before this. So, but leadership needs to be involved and comfortable and understand it's not a gotcha. So that's the second one. And then, it needs to be an evidence-based approach, because if you start putting this data in front of people and they start dismissing it because of the credibility of the data, they're just going to say, yeah, this is great. I don't believe it. You guys are doing bad math, or there's all these factors. One of the reasons we had the primary kind of score be based on how you rate against your peers is it takes a lot of that noise out, right? It isn't like a third party, survey that rates you against all these different industries and other dynamics and other organizations. It's here. These are the people that work with you, have essentially the same thing going on as you do. How do you show up? And we were lucky in that we had in my team, we already had done a lot of work that was very visible, and the credibility was there, as it should have been. I mean, we had a very capable team there, but you have to build that, I think, before you can kind of roll this thing out. Because if the data falls apart, the whole thing falls apart.
So these are great tips: high trust, believing in your employees, valuing the employees, creating this culture of authenticity, and getting involved early. I really like that a lot. Getting involved early, and just supporting them and having credibility. Any other tips for our audience, our younger audience, on
Just,
how they
just,
can have? Yeah.
just one. Sorry, I mean to cut you off. Just one, but I say this all the time, and I always kick myself when I don't say this. So authenticity as a leader is probably the most important thing. I'm assuming you have other guests that have said something similar. But if you're trying to be somebody you're not, because that's who you think you need to be, it is not going to last. I mean, we've seen it so much recently with all these kind of socio-political things that are going
Mhm.
on, and
Yeah.
people as leaders go out there and say, "Well, I think they want me to say this," and
Mhm.
and then that happens a couple cycles, and all of a sudden you're in a trap because you're kind of taking a position you don't believe in, and now whatever the core of yourself is from an authenticity standpoint, or your company is, or whatever it is, you're in trouble, right? So don't go down that
Mhm.
path. I mean, you're better off being an okay leader and authentic than a great leader and inauthentic, because at some point you're not going to be a great leader. It's going to fall apart on you. And I see that a lot, and I think it's a little bit liberating, just I hope it is, for leaders to be who they are. Don't, I mean, you
Mhm.
can always try to get better. I have a friend who's a CEO, very successful, um, of a Fortune probably 50 company, by any measure. He's had a fantastic career. And one of his favorite sayings is, "If you're not working on getting better every single day, you're selling yourself short." So I'm not saying be authentic and you're kind of you are or you are and you're done. I'm saying be authentically you are, and then try to keep working on yourself and as a person and as a leader, and you'll get better over time. But don't go down the inauthentic popular route, which I think is harder and harder. And I also think, we started this work in 2017, 16, 17, around there somewhere. Uh, I think it's probably more important than ever. These jobs have never been harder.
Mhm.
Being a leader right now is just so hard. Especially things like supporting the whole person and all the kind of external noise that's in there that's important to people. And how do you balance all that? People aren't, who's equipped to do that well? So anything organizations can do to help people get insight into where they need to work on and help them get better, I don't think there's ever been a more important time than now to make that happen.
Well, this has been such great insight, Dr. Almeida. I really like the way you're summarizing this on being a true, authentic leader, being yourself. So I just can't thank you enough for coming today and talking about management and leadership effectiveness and your background. I think you have a book there on that whole process, that step-by-step process. That's fantastic.
Yeah,
And
that
I would
doesn't sound like retirement, Dr. O. Just
I
saying.
know. And I'd love to write an article with you about having relationships with employees. Let's talk about that.
That's a good idea.
So again, thank you very much, Dr. Dave Almeda, principal at Mainsail Consulting and a retired award-winning chief human resource officer. And so thank you so much for coming today. Really, really enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it too, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to thank all of my audience for coming to my podcast today, taking the next step in leadership. Please be sure to look at HRC Vision. We'll have this podcast posted. If there's anything that I can do to help you in your career taking the next step or connecting to Dr. Almeda, he can assist you. We'll be happy to do it. We'll be happy to do so. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you in the next podcast.
You've been tuning in to Next Steps to Leadership with your host, Dr. Stephen Oliver. You can find this show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on our website, hrcvision.com. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.